Good afternoon and welcome to The Road to Recovery, The Road to Freedom with Mark. This is my 28-minute slot every Friday afternoon where I talk a bit about mental health issues. That's something I've been doing for many, many years. This is not some kind of jumping on the bandwagon like so many people seem to do. It's this flavour of the month thing, At the moment, it's changed. Very noticeable change. There was this cacophony of sound, of movement, started by good people, like John Kirwan and Mike King and fellas like that who have made tremendous strides forward for us all. Done an enormous amount of help. It really is good when people who have a high social profile decide to get in behind a very worthy cause and try and help to solve a problem that is a cancer on our society and kills a hell of a lot of people. 668 was the last count. That was suicides alone. Now, not every single one of those was due to depression, but most of them, the vast majority, were people with mental health issues, killing themselves and killing other people, and acts of desperation, I guess, to have hit rock bottom. There are those who decided to take their life because they had had enough pain and enough agony, people who have got old enough, because we as a society let our people down, firstly by not looking after and protecting those who suffer from mental health issues, and in fact by purposely creating the situations where young people are driven to desperation. But also we lack a decent euthanasia policy where people who have reached the end of their lives and will only get worse, will only have more and more and more pain until they die. There is no getting better. People who are dying from terminal cancer, heart failure, just growing old and worn out, and it is the end of their time. But instead of allowing them to die with dignity and not forcing them to endure what might be years of pain without any chance of any kind of recovery whatsoever, we force them to continue to live despite the fact that they just want it all to end. I watched my dad in end-of-life care for 3 years. 3 long years that poor old fella suffered. And by the time he did eventually die, which was in March this year, he was so diminished in every way, mentally, spiritually, physically. He was like a little bird, no more than skin and bone. I've never seen anyone like that, so frail, so weak that he couldn't even get out of bed for about 2 years, and yet they forced the poor old guy to keep on living. For what? I don't know. He never even drew the curtains or got out of bed. It was a really, really, really sad thing. And I feel for everybody who is going through that right now, and for every single person that has lost their mother and father, either or, loved ones, my thoughts and my heart go out to you. I know how it feels. I know what it's like to suffer from mental illness. I know what it's like to be driven to the brink of suicide and want only to escape, to finish the pain that you are in. It is an extraordinarily difficult thing to have to go through, and ostensibly people tend to do it on their own because nobody likes suffering. Nobody likes to see the ugliness and be reminded that that can and probably will happen to them at some point too. So they turn their backs and walk away. They reject what they find ugly and frightening. And I do understand that. But the reason that I do this show is to try and encourage people to help those who are suffering in any and every way they can, to just do a little bit because especially in the case of young people committing suicide, and there are hundreds of them every year, they are, all of them, every single one of them, suffering from low self-esteem, and they could sure do with a bit of picking up, and that's where you come in. Sometimes all it takes is just a kind word, a walk in the park, a cup of coffee, a meal. It can be such a little thing. But what you need to do is get the idea into those people's heads that they are worthy, they are okay. You know, a lot of people have images that they try to live up to, impossible images. Young women who are facing the pressure of body image, and you know, you see these stick insect models photoshopped on computers, and this is what we're telling young ladies, this is what you need to be, and if you're not, then you're not good enough. And that is an evil thing to do to anybody. What you have to do is get through to people this simple thought: you are okay. You are. You're good enough. You're a decent person, and I do care. And that, far more than any psychiatrist picking up the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff, that is what makes the difference. You make the difference. There's this old saying, a stitch in time saves nine, and it's all about prevention, preventing people from getting into that bad place before we have to try and fix something that is damaged and in many ways broken. It is so much harder to get somebody back from that deep, dark hole than to avoid it happening in the first place. And that is the issue that we really need to address. And all of us make that difference. And you must never give up trying. It is important to be thoughtful and to be patient. That is difficult. Sometimes you try and help somebody, they piss you off and you walk away. But, you know, it's important that you keep on trying and don't ever give up on people, because every single life is valuable and every one of them is worth saving. Well, first of all, I just want to say hi to everybody who is tuning in these days. We're up in the Hawke's Bay now. Welcome to you all. Nice to have you on board, and, you know, it's a beautiful part of the country. I hope to be visiting up there again very shortly. You know, I love the East Coast, and, you know, I love travelling around Aotearoa and seeing all the wonderful people who are out there. It's really interesting to go out and meet folks from other towns and get around. Also the Wairarapa, if you people up in the bay ever get the chance to come down here, there are some magnificent places to see. You know, pop in and have a look at Mount Holdsworth, and if you can, get out to Castle Point, and, you know, there's so many other good places to see. Martin Burr and Carterton, Fairley Marston. It's a brilliant place to live, and we're sort of doing our thing for the community here on Arrow Radio. Thank you very much to the sponsors who support us so well, and to Wairarapa TV for allowing us to expand, continue our good work, and especially to Michael and Veronica, who work so hard here. And, you know, they have to deal with all kinds of problems. Things do go wrong here. It seems seamless, but Michael and Veronica make it all happen, and they are the engine that makes this thing work. This is a not-for-profit organisation, a community radio. So we are all about community and people, helping people, being part of a community, not mindless entertainment, not reality TV, which is anything but. This is the real deal. This is ordinary people who are trying to make contact with ordinary people like yourselves. And it's all about community. It's all about us looking after each other, getting in touch with each other, finding out what's going on, all the interesting stories. Now, my show isn't just about rattling on about mental health issues. It's also about my adventures around the world, and the reason I do those is to remind myself of the wonderful days I had as a young man, and before I was too plagued with mental issues. I had an amazing life. I've lived all round the world and seen all kinds of things and met all kinds of people. And the more people I met, the more I came to realise just how similar we are to each other. The way our governments behave is not the way we behave. It is not what we want, and I don't know why we allow our governments around the world to make war on each other, because that is not what the civilians want. Right, well, story time. This is in one of the adventures I had around New Zealand. I've written a few about them, and this is a difficult one, but I think you'll like it. This is called the Eye of the Storm. I had $2.5 grand burning a hole in my pocket and found an old launch selling for that. It was in a poor state and I had visions of restoring it. So I headed down to Picton to take it for a spin before parting with my cash. All seemed in working order and the guy selling it had a broken leg. I shelled out the asking price, organised a berth for it in Wellington and cancelled the one in Picton. I made plans to motor it down Queen Charlotte Sounds, along Tory Channel and anchor it there for the night. Then at first light, cross Cook Strait into Wellington Harbour. A bold but doable plan with 2 calm days in a row. As soon as I returned home, I fell ill with terrible headaches, sinus and jaw pain. I had no idea of the cause, but it had me bedridden for a good 6 months. All of the good weather passed by, and the launch sat on its moorings, slowly deteriorating. Eventually it started taking on water, and the Coast Guard were called to pump it out. I was forced to have it taken under tow to a shipwrights to have it fixed. Had I the wisdom to send it to the tip, then this story would have been short and sweet. But I was determined to get it seaworthy and make the dangerous trip across Cook Strait. The launch was taken in and out of the water a number of times, had the bilge pump replaced and $1,000's worth of mechanical work done on it. All of this chewing up time and money whilst I was at home sick. Eventually I developed an abscess on my jaw, which swelled up to the size of an orange. It burst, and after 3 days I rang an ambulance to take me to hospital. At the hospital they told me I needed an operation urgently and had to drive up north to New Plymouth, some 250 kilometres away. By the time I got there I had bad blood poisoning, so they put me on an antibiotic drip and filled me full of morphine. The pain was unbearable. Like malaria, my body would boil, then freeze, and the morphine made me puke. Within 24 hours, the antibiotics had done the trick, though more than once I had begged for death. A surgeon gave me a local anaesthetic that didn't work and operated me in the raw. After more waves of pain, he finally wrenched a molar and drained the abscess. I recovered at home and it was soon spring. The boat builder rang to say the launch was ready to sail, so I headed down to Picton. I took a rod and reel, tackle, clothes, tools, my dog Diamond, and as much cash as I could spare. The ferry crossing was uneventful and boded well for the return journey. When I got to the boat builders, I shelled out another $500 cash and was assured all was in working order. The main steering wheel was not connected up, so I would have to steer from the rear tiller, and I noticed the V-belts of the alternator looked rather slack, but was assured a mechanic had looked it over and all was well. I was excited but worried and nervous at the same time. The weather forecast was good, but crossing Cook Strait in a 10-metre launch is a long and dangerous undertaking at any time. Everyone back home warned me against it with what-if scenarios that only made me more determined to do it. I had owned a couple of small boats and worked crew on a commercial trawler, so I had a healthy respect for the sea. The launch itself was quite capable of a job, being fitted out with a Fordson diesel tractor engine with a cruising speed of 6 knots. Slow but capable of running all day at that speed. She was 10 metres long, but had a narrow 3 to 4 metre beam. Shaped like a large canoe, was a double-ended caravel style, which made it rock badly, but its overall lines were very nice. Despite its loud tractor engine and rockiness, it was a nice ride and very responsive to the steering. She felt almost alive to the touch, guiding me which way to steer her. Having a double-planked kauri timber hull meant that she moved with the water. Being 100 years old and handmade, a lot of care and attention to detail had been put into making her. Steering her from the tiller arm meant more direct contact with the rudder, which enhanced both the ride and steering. It was a feeling of true freedom to have the motor humming along in the protection of Queen Charlotte Sounds. These boats in earlier times were called Sounds Specials or Sardine Specials, purpose-built for plying these waters. I decided to strike out, buoyed on by the fact it had only just been repaired and the responsive feel of the craft. I headed up Queen Charlotte, past the many quaint and beautiful bays, their shy batches peeping out from native bush and pine tree. A few hours' run like this had my blood pumping, so I turned northeast into Tory Channel in the final stretch of the first leg. I anchored 3 bays back from the entrance of the channel and made up a feed for myself and the dog. I drifted easily off to sleep, hoping to be home the following day. At dawn I woke, but noticed the tide running hard, so delayed leaving the entrance for a couple of hours. Around 8 a.m. I struck out, but it made little difference. A spring tide was running, and the mouth at the entrance of Tory was white, with a 2-metre confused chop for about 1 kilometre out. As soon as I hit the chop, the boat began to knife into the confused sea. With no safe direction to steer, I tried to hammer through it. The rough sea rattled everything so badly that the engine threw the loose V-belt. Then the engine cut out. I was at the mercy of this angry mess, and the engine would not restart. Half an hour later, I decided to raise an SOS to the Coast Guard back to Picton. Their vessel was a Naiad with 2 huge outboards and would have me under tow within a few hours. I felt sick to the pit of my stomach, knowing that I would be dragged back past the cute batches, like a hall of shame, all the way back to Picton. They had trouble finding me, so I let off flares and gave them my coordinates. A rope was lashed to the bow, and I was hauled at about 4 knots back down Tory Channel and Queen Charlotte Sounds to Picton. Waiting for me were the police and the harbour master and a small band of gawking onlookers. The police were not too bothered, but the harbour master banned me from leaving port until my boat could be repaired. He was horrified by the look of the launch, but calmed down a little when I told him I had just spent 3 months at the boat builders. So I was stuck in Picton until I could find a mechanic. I was gutted things had gone so badly, especially since it was the dodgy V-belt that had failed. For the first time in years, I decided to go drown my sorrows at the pub, leaving the dog on board to guard the boat. I wandered uptown to Mike's Bar, which had a nice garden bar where I could smoke, a dining area for some well-priced pub meals, and a lounge of pokie machines. I had a few pints and wasted some money onto the pokies until I hit the jackpot of over $900. My financial problems sorted for the week, I had a steak and struck up a friendship with the extended family that owned and ran the premises. I headed back in better spirits, fed and walked the dog, then slept very soundly, exhausted by the day's events. The next day I walked the dog early, found a good bakery, and headed down to the mechanic who had charged me $1,000 for checking the motor over. When I got there, he wanted nothing to do with me and laughed when I asked him to come and have a look at the motor. Too busy, was all he told me, and it was quickly apparent I would get no joy. I knew the boat builder would be no better. I tried to get the launch shipped down, but could not get it unloaded in Wellington. My first day stuck in Picton came to a grinding halt, so I headed back to Mike's Bar for some good company, beers and a steak. Another couple of hundred at the pokies lifted my spirits, so my stay turned out to be reasonably pleasant. The next day I tracked down another mechanic over in Wairarapa Bay who could come over in a few days for a look. So I settled into a routine of walking the dog in the morning, then the bakery, and later in the day off down the pub. A few pleasant days passed by till the mechanics called. 2 of them turned up and were insistent that the motor had not been touched. I had been ripped off, and the V-belt was over 90% worn out. They replaced it for a paltry $18.66 and started the motor up again. One guy ran me through the right start-up procedure and how to bleed air from the system. A simple fix and a bit of reassurance, and I was happy again. The weather had not been the best, but a window of opportunity was coming up, so I headed back to Mike's Bar for my final night, said my goodbyes and headed back to my boat. The next morning I headed off. This time, however, I changed the plan for the route home. This time I would take the much longer trip, all the way up to the end of Queen Charlotte Sounds, and anchor for the night at Endeavour Inlet, where I knew a couple. I had an uneventful run of some 6 hours, with winds picking up to 20 knots. That night I walked round to Furneaux Lodge, enjoyed a good feed and a few beers. I caught up with some fishermen from Wellington who were staying over. They told me I would have to head off early as a front was coming in the afternoon. I packed it in early and slept a little fitfully, worried about the next day's crossing. I woke to a cloudy morning and motored out of Endeavour Inlet and Queen Charlotte Sound at a steady 4 knots, taking about 4 hours. It was eerily calm as I cleared the sounds and rounded the corner into Cook Strait. I opened up the motor to 6 knots as a large gentle swell pushed across my bow. The wind rose slowly, increasing about 5 knots every hour. By the time I passed the Brothers Rock, it was 15 knots, with a slow 2-metre swell, and I noticed my fishing friends tucked in close to the rocks. Within 10 minutes, I noticed a large swell breaking over the top of Karori Rock on the other side of the straits. Within another 5 minutes, I was smack into a spring storm. The wind of 30 to 40 knots was opposed to the tide, which made the sea rise up in huge, confused peaks of wave. The panic rose in my throat as I suddenly realised the sea was too big for my launch. At first I tried to pick a course headlong into the waves, but they began to curl and break. I came slamming down their backs as the swell lifted me to 5 metres. The wind now howled over the waves, sweeping the top back in a foul hissing mess. I was forced to turn about and try to run with the swell, but the waves were huge and sucked the launch backwards, up the face and into the barrel of the breaker. I gave it full throttle in a vain attempt to run with this now enormous swell. It was far too rough to do anything but hold on for grim life. I couldn't even get an SOS off. No ships were visible. I knew rescue was impossible. I was alone. Suddenly I was sucked backwards, up an enormous swell. For a few agonising seconds I rode the top of this monster like a surfer, disappearing back inside the barrel. Then we shot out and into space. The launch dropped away under me, and I was launched into mid-air, the tiller arm in one hand as I flailed helplessly. Whilst in mid-air I had enough time to say, "Oh, I'm an effing dead man," before plummeting straight down to the place I had just left. It felt like an eternity, locked in place as we flew along the face of this enormous wave. Eventually we slid back and were sucked backwards, and I came off the top of a wave. The launch landed with an explosion like a hand grenade inside the cabin. The fuel tank was blown off and thrown across the cabin. I landed in a heap and was almost knocked out. The dog came staggering out of the wreckage and collapsed on the deck, seemingly dead. I felt a sudden wave of anger cut through my fear. With trembling hands I reattached the tiller arm. Almost instinctively I knew we needed power back if I was to have any hope of survival. I had to abandon the steering and reattach the fuel tank, leaving the boat at the mercy of the sea. I was thrown all over the place, smashing my head, knees and elbows, but somehow I managed to reattach the tank. In my head I could hear my old skipper giving me orders of what to do next. I furiously bled the fuel lines like the mechanic had showed me, gave it some engine start and turned the key. Slowly the engine coughed back into life and I hammered it into full throttle. I stumbled back to the stern and reattached the tiller arm and headed over the face of an enormous wave. This time I turned and headed down the face, staying within centimetres of the breaking top. I braced my feet against the side and my chest and arms locked the tiller arm in place. We came hurtling down the first wave like an express train at a good 30 knots. The sea hissed and screamed behind me like 1,000 angry snakes, and I was too petrified to look back. The launch shuddered under the strain, and I knew another mistake would be my last. It felt like an eternity locked in place as we flew along the face of these enormous waves. I just have to finish her up now. I made it across the Cook Strait in one piece and rode out the storm, and slowly motored back along Bering Strait, riding the top of the big swell which had now calmed somewhat, and rounded the corner into Halswell Point and back into Evans Bay. It was so calm it was hard to believe that I had just been through that wicked storm. Unfortunately, when I pulled into the mooring, I noticed that the boat was sinking. It was taking on more water than the bilge pump could handle, so I had to get it hauled out of the water and taken up on the hard. Turns out I'd split the hull open and popped all the rivets in the boat, and it would need an enormous amount of work to be fixed. I couldn't keep it where it was, so I had to haul it over to Mana, and I couldn't afford the cost of having the boat on the hard as well as repairing it, so I gave it away for a song. Unfortunately, I had to give up on my dream of restoring my launch, and I only ever took one trip on that amazing boat. Through the eye of the storm. It is a journey that I will never forget. The end. I hope you enjoyed that. Time for me to go. I'll see you again next week. Thank you for tuning in, and if you can, help someone who is suffering from mental issues, from depression or whatever, and you never know, you just might save a life. So thanks for tuning in, and catch you again next week. Bye for now.